Wim, I'd love to begin by asking what it's like to spend this much time with the Pope and how you feel it changed you in the process, or if it did.
I wish you had an easier question to begin with.
Or we can start with how did you get involved in the project? We'll work up to the second one.
No, I can answer either one. It all started with a letter. I never intended to make a film with a Pope. I don't think any filmmaker would think that is a possibility. You just don't consider that until you get a letter one day with stamps from the Vatican. And I thought, I first was scared. What did I do wrong? Am I going to get punished for something? But then it was an invitation to come by and discuss the possibility of making a movie. Of course, that made me sort of curious. You never know. I had no intention who wrote the letter. I mean, I had no idea who wrote the letter, and I had no idea what the intention was. So I went by a couple of months later, and it turned out that it was a close collaborator of the Pope, his new Secretariat of Communication, and the man was a movie buff, and he had actually taught cinema in university, and now he was in charge of this new Office of Communication. He said, we're considering that maybe the Pope, because the Pope is communicating in such different way than any before, so maybe a movie would be something we could consider, and we want to discuss it with you. And I said, well, sure, that would be interesting, but not if you guys produce it. And they said, no, that's none of our intention. We would just instigate it, and you would have to come up with a film, and you'd have to actually finance it and produce it independently, and we're going to keep out of it. We just want to throw the seed out there. And that's how it all started. And eventually, I met the man actually 4 times, 2 hours, 8 hours. And it did change. I mean, it didn't feel like a movie for me. I spent 4 years on this and editing for 2 years and watching hundreds and hundreds of hours of stuff. And it felt like nothing I'd done before. It wasn't even a film, I thought. It was some sort of, in a different way, part of my life than any film before. And it was scary because in the beginning I didn't think of it as a different film. And then I realized it was so different because it was a different responsibility. I mean, you can shoot with some old man in Havana or with a choreographer or with a photographer, and it's a whole different ballgame. Then out of a sudden you make a film with the Pope and nobody tells you what to do. They never gave me any notes, they never gave me any input. They said, you do it and we keep out of it. And that is scary. I wish I had had somebody to interfere, but nobody interfered. I mean, you know that feeling, Michael? It's just, you do it, and wow, and then you get scared. I had so many sleepless nights over this. Because in the course of the making of the film, in the beginning, 2013, when I got the letter, this was a different planet. There was Obama, and there was people in places of power who were reasonable. And somehow in the course of the making of the film, I realized this man, the Pope, was the only one left you can count on.
So the question is if there was anything about his expectations that he was surprised by the Pope.
There was a lot that was surprising. I mean, I knew his writing, I knew his encyclica, but then the man was something very different. There was such an endless optimism in him, and such a great curiosity and openness, an unbelievable ability to make contact, not just with me, but with all the people I saw him get in touch with. And in the end, it was his fearlessness, his complete absence of fear that really surprised me the most. And I've seen the film with lots of audiences, and I've seen it with Catholic audiences and Protestant and socialists and atheists, and the hardest audience are the Catholics. A lot of them don't like him that much. It's amazing. He faces a lot of resistance in his own church. And maybe I think it's his genuine openness. Some of the things he says really shocked me. The complete absence to want to be missionary in any way and really accept all other religions, and his deep social concerns and caring for the planet and all of this. I think doing the editing, I don't do previews and stuff, but every now and then I showed the film to a couple of my friends and you need some input, and I badly needed input. And some of my most ardent critics were some hardcore atheists. And this guy sat there and he started crying in the beginning of the film, and he cried all the way through. And I know he had nothing to do with religion. So I realized that man touches some sort of utopian desire we have for a better world that is not just a Christian idea.
So the question here is, this gentleman was expressing that the Pope can do more radical things than you see him do, like selling a few paintings, for example, to help with the refugees. And the question for Wim was whether or not that stuff is happening more behind the scenes or not.
Question is, how much power does he have? I mean, he doesn't have any military or political power. I don't think he can sell off St. Peter or the Michelangelos. I don't think he can do that. I think he needs, and the transparency he really wants to achieve in the church is something that he still needs everybody else to see it through. And he can, and quite often I felt it was sort of a Sisyphus work that he's doing, sort of pushing something uphill and needing so many other people to see his ideas through. And we made the film pretty much under the radar, and nobody in the Vatican really knew what we were doing, except for 3 or 4 people. And I realized why, because this man faces an enormous resistance, Scary, actually. And quite unbelievable that he survived until now.
So the question is whether Wim asked him personal questions or tried, or whether that was outside the purview of what he could do.
Well, I didn't ask him. I asked him 55 questions over the course of 4 sessions, of each time 2 hours. But of course you don't hear my questions, and I didn't want to appear. And there were some personal questions, but in the end, I never intended to make a biographical film on him. It was really more biography of his ideas and what he stood for and his issues. So, because I feel today's culture is so much people-oriented, and I'm pretty sick and tired of all this stuff about people. So I wanted it to be about his issues. And I did ask a couple of personal questions and I decided not to use them. They ended up on the editing room floor. He doesn't know movies, for instance.
Had he seen any of your films?
No.
He doesn't know movies.
He doesn't know movies. The last films he saw was Italian neorealism in the 60s.
Wow.
He liked La Strada and Miracle of Milan, and I think he never saw any other movie afterwards. And the first thing he said when we met was, I heard a lot about you, but you must know I haven't seen any of your films.
Wow.
Which I thought was good.
Has he seen this film? Did he watch
No.
the Not even the film?
No.
Well.
I'm a little, I wouldn't say pissed off, but I'm a little disappointed. But then again, I understand. I wouldn't want to see a film where I appear all the time. And I think he's so much into people, he doesn't need images of people. It's a big difference.
So the style was that the Pope talked directly into the camera. Was that the Pope's choice or Wim's choice? And why?
Yes, he does talk directly to you. And I'm very grateful to my New York colleague Errol Morris for the invention of the Interrotron. I would have invented it otherwise for this movie. And you can actually do it with a simple teleprompter. When I realized I was going to have this chance to sit opposite this man for long sessions, I also realized that this was such a privilege that it was exactly what I didn't want to have for myself, but for the audience. And so the Interrotron sort of imposed itself very quickly. And so it's basically a semi-transparent mirror in front of the camera. It's one of the oldest instruments in cinema. Camera can shoot through that mirror, but from the other side, you don't see the camera. Every teleprompter basically works with such a semi-transparent thing. And so he saw my face and he spoke into my eye, and I had the same device on the other side. I saw him, looked him in the eye, and we saw each other. We had that technology in between us. And I couldn't really explain that to anybody before. So I just did it, and I was really nervous before the first shoot because he somehow had to agree with this procedure. And he immediately understood when he came in. He looked at the setup and the camera, and that was his chair, and he said, "Where are you going to be?" And then I explained it to him, and he said, "And so where do you sit?" And I showed him around on the other side of the camera, the same setup, and he understood it right away, and then he said, "Great, good, let's go for it." And he didn't see anybody else. He didn't see camera people or sound people. He just saw the teleprompter with my face, and we were very intimate, but we had this technology in between, and it allowed for, because I know a little bit about his idea, and I knew a little bit about his idea of cercanía, of closeness. So I figured if I shot an interview and he would look past the camera, he couldn't really convey his very idea of communication. So it worked really well, and he understood it, and he also very well understood my request that I wouldn't have to put in my questions, so he would answer the questions by implying the question, and he totally stuck to it. And not many people can actually do that. I know for myself, because when I'm asked to do that in an interview, I always fuck up.
So the question is, how are people in the countries that he filmed seeing the movie? Is it in cinemas? Is it on television?
So far, the film has come out in Europe and in America, and it has not come out, to my great disappointment, so far in Latin America. And we're fighting hard to make it happen. And it's apparently a lot to do with the distribution system there, and I'm a little bit desperate because we wanted it to be available for everybody. It will still be available, but maybe via streaming. And I mean, I'd be all for it to be public domain, and hopefully, eventually, it will be. Actually, for once, I'd encourage any pirating, because the film is made to be seen by people and not to make money at the box office.
So have the powers to be at the Vatican seen the film?
I'm not quite sure who has seen it. In Germany and in America, and I followed those, and in Italy I've been in several screenings, or in Geneva at the United Nations, and there were representatives of the Catholic Church, and I know of some cardinals who saw it, and the one in Munich actually mentioned the film several Sundays in his sermons. So others were a little hostile, and as I said, the Pope faces a lot of flack in the church. So I know of Catholic priests and part of the Curia who are not so excited about the movie. But it's it's pro and con.
So the question is, with this Pope in particular, did he have the impression that people around him almost felt forced to have more integrity? Like, is he making people better?
I think he tries his very best to live what he preaches. And so I noticed these shoes he was wearing. He had holes in his shoes. And when we shot in the park once, he came with a Fiat 500. This is the smallest car available in Italy. So, and he lives in this pensione, which is really cheap. So he tries his best to encourage people to be more modest. And I know from his surroundings, and I know from our own film crew, and I know from people who have met him that they're impressed with the impact he leaves on people, and I do want to think that it does rub off his conviction. It did on me.
Well, I wanted to return to my first question. How do you feel? Do you feel different after having gone through this experience? You've made so many films in your life, but having done this film on the Pope and spending that time, did you yourself feel like something had changed in you?
Well, it's especially his fearlessness that makes you realize what am I afraid of actually, and why. And so I think it did rub off on me, and his never-ending optimism and positive attitude, it does rub off. I hope it holds. Yeah. I know a lot of people are not coming to see it because I think it's a film with a Pope, so why should we see it? And it's a hurdle the film has to take, but people who do see it feel encouraged by it. And it touches on many things that none of our bloody politicians dares to say anymore, nowhere. In Europe and America and China and Russia, none of our politicians tells us that we could also stop with this holy cow called growth and stop with that and make sure that others catch up with us. None of them, nobody anywhere dares to tell us that growth is not necessary anymore and that we can steer economics and the financial justice into a different direction. And nobody does it. Nobody dares doing it. Nobody dares saying growth is not necessary.
So before I get to the question, this lady was also pointing out that Wings of Desire, which is beautifully restored, and I saw it last week, it's playing at the Film Forum, and then he has a documentary here today, and both films in their own way deal with the humanitarian crisis post-World War II. But then the question right now is, how does Wim decide between kind of which medium he chooses, whether it's the fiction or whether it's the documentary?
It's a big question right now in my life. If I'm going to continue with fiction, because there's one thing about fiction and non-fiction, there is no border, and it's not clear where one ends and where the other one begins. And my fictional films have all been very much reality-driven and place-driven, and I'm always been anxious to have reality come in through the cracks of fiction. And in all my documentaries, I somehow had a tendency to bring in some fiction. I mean, Buena Vista Social Club is clearly a fairy tale. You might think of it as a documentary, and I thought I was making a documentary, but I was witnessing an actual fairy tale. Or Pina. I mean, we were in a documentary way filming dance, but her dance performances are straight fiction. So I was filming fiction, but is that a documentary, or what is it then? So, and but the sad thing about fiction these days is that it is so difficult to convey people who are involved, producers, financiers, to let you be open for anything that is unforeseeable. In documentary, yes, the unforeseeable, your crew behind you, they're ready for it. They're ready for something to happen that you're not planned. In fiction, I love if something happens that is not planned, but it's getting more and more difficult to be allowed to let that enter. And most fiction today is planned from like a production line, and the unforeseeable is not really allowed in anymore. Wings of Desire was shot without a script from one day to another. It was completely allowing the unforeseeable to enter the film every day. And that today is impossible. I couldn't make a film anymore I couldn't get it off the ground without a firm script. So chances are I'll continue doing documentaries, because at least everybody behind me and with me is ready for something to happen that we do not understand yet. And that's the whole thrill about filmmaking, that you don't know it before you do it. I always think it's a waste of time if you do something that you've already figured out before.
I would ask one more question, but that's such a strong ending. I almost feel I don't even want to touch it. So please help me thank Wim Wenders for being with us here this evening with his spectacular film. Thank you.
Thank you.